Hello everybody and thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Board from Distill Communications and I'm delighted to welcome you to what is guaranteed to be a fascinating session which explores what validation ready labelling really means, both in principle and in practice. During the course of this discussion, we will explore how medical device, clinical trial and pharmaceutical companies can proactively manage labelling risk and explain best practice in the implementation of validation ready, cloud-based global labelling systems. You'll notice that this webinar is browser-based, so if you disconnect for any reason, please just click on the link that you received via email to rejoin the session. In order to ask questions, you can send them in via the questions widget. Just type them into the box at the top left-hand corner of your screen and click submit. We will allocate some time at the end of the session to address any questions or thoughts that you may have, and on an anonymous basis. Please use the yellow help widget if you require any assistance, and you can move, resize and maximize any of the windows in front of you to get a better view of the slides. I'm delighted to be joined today by Phil Dray, Test Manager at Prism ID, Doug Lantigua from Validated Cloud, and Stephen Farrell from Compliance Path. Between them, they have many years of accumulated working knowledge of this vital area of labelling compliance. I'm sure we're going to learn a great deal from today's discussion, and we've asked speakers to explore how industry cannot afford to take shortcuts when validating their labelling systems and processes. Today's learning points will include understanding which compliance requirements need to be met, including 21 CFR Part 11, Quality System Annex 2, and ISO 13485 document control requirements. Also realizing how to proactively manage risk by implementing a standardized approach using the GAMP5 model. Gaining an understanding of what you must look for in a cloud-based labeling solution to meet validation requirements. And finally, knowing how you can reduce time and make significant cost savings by leveraging cloud-based platforms and your supplier to meet future needs and ongoing maintenance requirements. So, Phil, I wonder if you could start by explaining more about Prism ID and what we mean by validation ready.
That's great. Thank you very much for the introduction there. So the system as a total is required to revolve around product quality, patient safety and data integrity. So the labelling system must be able to ensure patient safety and data integrity, and therefore ensuring your labelling system is fit to meet your requirements under regulatory obligations is a must. So this journey will look to ask questions, look to provide some best practice guidance on the reality of being validation ready. So what is validation ready? So essentially this is deploying a system which has all the objective evidence required, which is based around the GAMP5 guideline. They're ready for you. All the functionality testing done, results and reports available and transparent, so you can move forward with the final stages of validation based on risk, with confidence that the functional testing has been completed. This evidence, along with on-site policies and procedures, will ensure your system will stand muster at a CSV audit. So let's remind ourselves of the GAMP5 model approach to validation and where we can consider at what point we are validation ready. So here's a GAMP5 suggested approach for a configured product, or category 4 products here, with the supplier activities typically including functional specifications, configuration specifications, testing and functional testing. So once you've applied the Princess supplier leveraging, you should only really be left with your user requirements, and depending on your workflow, these requirements may be covered in a functional specification your supplier has, and requirements testing, what could be considered the last part of validation. So it can be considered So everything from the user requirement specification to the operational qualification can be leveraged from your supplier, leaving only the validation master plan and PQ testing and validation report to be added by the client or by yourselves. So can you leverage your supplier? Well, yes, and yes, and yes, you should. So one of the key concepts of the GAMP5 guideline is leveraging your supplier. And this may take the form of delivery of products and services or maintenance and support of products and services. Your supplier is a recognised subject matter expert on the system and will hold the system documents and test evidence you may require during the course of a regulatory audit. You must remember that you can also leverage not only documents but also personnel. And this is useful when considering your team dynamic during the final validation phase. Remember, although the responsibility for compliance with GXP regulation lies with a regulated company, your supplier may have a considerable involvement with the process. So what do you need to look for? Firstly, does your supplier have a recognised quality management system? After all, you need to demonstrate that you are in control of your business, so you should also expect that your supplier is in control of theirs. And remember, under 21 CFR 820, under section 820.50, this does discuss ensuring you are taking the necessary steps to ensure your supplier is fit for purpose. Can your supplier support your document needs? As I say, if it's not documented, it's a rumour, and it's no good saying at an audit, well, I think it works this way, and I believe I have proof. You have to show it. So you should expect to see the following: functional specifications, what the system does, testing evidence with objective evidence. This will probably be around the functional testing and demonstrates that your system proves what it does based upon the functional specification. Some kind of traceability matrix. You need to know what in your functional specification was tested and where it was tested and did it pass and what evidence do you have that it passed at that time. This document can also be seen as the start of the risk assessment you need to carry out to establish your test needs. So taking your traceability matrix and working out what testing you need to do against your business requirements will give you the test that you need to do. Summary reports, details of what happened during the development and testing cycles, transparent reports. So what do I need to do? Well, don't waver. You're nearly there. Along with your supplier, you've done all the hard graft. And look to leverage documentation which supports your regulatory obligations. Now we should look at what you need to do. So audit your supplier. Remember, regulated companies who wish to leverage supplier knowledge and documentation need to ensure that they are suitable and fit for purpose. This usually follows a formal assessment. Well, it may be a desktop assessment, depending on the complexity and novelty of the solution being provided. So what do you need to look for? Is there a recognised quality management system? Is there objective evidence to support the quality management system? Are there policies and procedures which support the documentation and services being leveraged? You will also need to make sure you've created your validation master plan. After all, you are going to have to stand toe-to-toe with the auditor to show that you've met your regulatory obligations. Don't remember, if it's not documented, it's a rumour. Perform your gap analysis to establish what testing you need to do. In reality, this should only be testing which supports your business processes, as detailed in the validation master plan. Remember, you've leveraged all the functional testing from your supplier. Create your test cases. Again, in reality, as you're leveraging supplier documentation, the functional evidence should already be in place as the hard work has been done, leaving you to create appropriate PQ tests or process tests around your business case testing. So remember, all the functional testing has been done up to this point. Now you need to execute and report. Remember, you need to summarize the output against your validation master plan. And if you're using a standard customizable or configurable off-the-shelf application with no bespoke coding or configuration coding involved, an on-site process you should be painless and efficient. It may well be your supplier has OT documents which can be leveraged and turned into performance PQ documents. So the $64 million question is, what does this do to my validation timeline? The example shows the traditional timeline for validation preparation followed by execution and reporting. However, if you are using the principles of validation ready, then your validation preparation is shorter as you've leveraged your supplier as the subject matter expert and their validation ready solution. Remember though, that all the testing with objective evidence and validation document pack, which mitigates the spectre if it's not documented, it's a rumour. The execution time becomes reduced as you test the things that matter. Your business cases they're demonstrating that you are fit for intended use. There's no advantage of retesting what your supplier has already done. Remember also that your supplier will undoubtedly have installation and operational qualifications you can leverage. It's the same principle for reports. The validation-ready documentation pack may have summary reports of supplier testing. These can be leveraged into your validation summary report, leaving you only to add the results of your testing. So in conclusion, select your supplier. Leverage as much as possible. This will be documents and documented evidence. Create your validation master plan. There is a possibility that if you're being supplied with a commercial off-the-shelf solution, your supplier may well have a validation master plan which you can build upon. For example, now all you need to do is to complete the last couple of items. Create your PQ and business case tests. These need to demonstrate that the solutions fit and base against your business requirements and execute. And finally, report on what happened against the validation master plan. By leveraging your supplier and being validation ready, the time taken for the final piece of validation before moving into a production environment for your labeling needs will be efficient and shorter, hopefully, as you're involving your supplier. And more importantly, quicker than the traditional method of you performing the validation processes, in isolation. So that's a brief outline of, validation ready. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. That was really helpful. We've had a number of questions in, and do please keep them coming. First up, Doug and then Stephen, I wondered if you might introduce yourselves and explain your roles and experience in relation to the points covered by Phil.
Sure. Thank you very much, Andrew. This is Doug Lantiba from Validated Cloud. I'm one of the principals here at Validated Cloud. Validated Cloud is a community cloud for the life sciences, where all we do is host regulated workloads and data for the life science industry. Our foundations are in quality, and what we do is provide the foundation for the hosting of any type of validated application, where we have what Phil described as the foundations in quality with change controls and informal objective evidence. All of the documentation is there to present for audits. So what we do is we really accelerate the delivery of validated systems by providing fully qualified infrastructure and then ongoing support. for those systems. Stephen?
Thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Farrell. I'm one of the founders of Compliance Path. We are a IT regulatory consultancy. The vast majority of the work that we do is in the life sciences. We have kind of three focus areas, one being IT governance. Doug touched on some of that. So we do a lot of work helping companies get their ISO 27001 certification, their SOC 2 attestation report. We also work with High Trust, which is a little bit more on the healthcare side typically. We're also very involved helping companies that are selling into the life sciences, selling their software service platforms into the regulated space, helping them commercialize, helping them understand what their vendors are going to ask, understand the barriers of entry before you start selling software into the regulated vertical. And then we also work with regulated companies themselves to help them find sensible risk-based solutions to their validation needs as they bring on cloud vendors, traditional legacy vendors, and so on. So happy to be part of the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So this is the panel section of today's webinar, and very glad that all three of you are able to join. If I can turn first to Doug, we've heard about how industry can work their way through the complexity that's validation. Would you give a perspective on what is needed to gain full compliance in a cloud-based solution?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew. As I referred to earlier in my introduction to who we are, it's really the foundation where you're building your compliant IT infrastructure in a way that meets US, EU, and UK regulations and provide the objective evidence, provide the executed scripts and controls needed to host a validated infrastructure, a validated application. And it really shows what our entire platform is built for intended use to host validated systems and also have in place the data integrity controls when it comes to being ready to install an application, validated application. So we're really the first relay runner in getting a solution to the customer.
Great, thank you, Doug. Stephen, I know you've got an industry role developing regulations, and we've covered some of the key regulations, including 21 CFR Part 11 Annex 2 and ISO 13485, as well as how to implement a standardized approach using GAMP5. How do you see the regulatory landscape evolving now, especially in relation to computer software assurance?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So I think there's a couple of different areas that are certainly evolving at the moment. To kind of take it back 3 or 4 years, that the FDA in the US came out and said that they were looking seriously at aligning the quality system regulation, which is the current regulation for medical devices, 21 CFR Part 820, and starting to look at harmonizing that with ISO 13485. I think with COVID and everything that's come with that, that's probably slowed that initiative down a little bit. But what has happened in parallel is that there was a move coming from the Case for Quality initiative in CDRH, which is the division of FDA that regulates medical devices, to provide guidance to industry on an appropriate approach for the validation, or what they're calling the assurance of commercial off-the-shelf software. What's been interesting about that discussion, and it's creeping closer and closer every day to a draft guidance document from the FDA, is that while the discussion began within the device community, it's now expanded out, and as I understand it, CBER and CEDAR are involved, and they, collectively effectively regulate the vast majority of the companies and that we work with. So there's been a lot of, I think, probably misunderstanding about what the point of the Computer Software Assurance Guide is. Some of the early presentations that I saw of it, I had very early access, very kindly, from the FDA to some of the early thinking. And I would say that if you've been doing CSV for a long time, some of the things that were being suggested, at least on the surface, appeared to be perhaps a little on the liberal side, I would say. However, one of the things that's kind of happened, I think, to influence the CSA thinking over the last probably last 12 months is that many of my colleagues from GAMP have come in to the team, and I think what we're seeing now is that when this guidance does come out, it's going to be very much aligned with GAMP 5. So I think from a practitioner's perspective, certainly within a regulated company, the actual approach, the way that we look at risk-based testing and that type of thing won't change too much. There are a couple of areas, though, where I think thinking will have to evolve. One being the relationship with a vendor, right? So, Phil touched on that. Doug and I are both vendors in our own respect when it comes to regulated companies. But one of the things that's quite clearly going to be in the guidance document, I think, is a refocus and an expectation that regulated companies can do less from a validation perspective if they truly have confidence in their vendors, right? So to properly leverage a vendor, you have to do a good assessment, clearly, through your audit process. But beyond that, I think it could impact vendors fairly significantly if they're not prepared. So for our regulated companies that are shopping, right, that are looking for new things, a recommendation to them would be, find a vendor like Prism ID who gets it, right, who have a firm understanding of what it means to be, quote unquote, validation ready. There's lots of choices in the market. Some vendors have been pretty successful to date, sort of saying, well, this is our IP, we don't show this, and sort of making the audit process difficult. My recommendation to any vendor would be, don't do that. Make your processes transparent, make yourself as leverageable as possible so that regulated companies can very quickly establish confidence that you know what you're doing, and then they can focus their validation activities truly on intended use in the last mile. So I think vendors who get it, will be able to kind of look at the computer software assurance approach with in a very positive way, and should be able to really help their customers meet their compliance obligations very quickly. I think those who resist or who have traditionally resisted will probably struggle. I think another knock-on effect to the CSA is going to be, frankly, companies like mine. A lot of validation projects, historically have been 6 months, a year long, 18 months long. The cost of validation vastly outstripping the cost of the software. I truly believe those days are over. I think that, if we are really doing a CSA-based approach, if it's truly risk-based and leverageable, then validation projects really should be taking weeks now rather than months or certainly years. I think there'll be an evolution over time to get to that point, but I certainly think that's where it's going. I don't view that negatively. I think ultimately, what the FDA has been saying for years, certainly what GAMP has tried to push for years, has been the concept of the least burdensome approach, really taking a risk-based angle on everything and really focusing on, what matters, right? Ultimately, our goal is patient safety and product quality, and that should be what we focus our efforts on. But I do think it's going to be an adjustment. A lot of folks really meet the compliance burden and then go way beyond And I think if you want to be competitive, regardless of whether you're selling drugs or selling services, you're going to have to make an adjustment. So that's pretty interesting. I think it's good to see a bit of regulation around this subject because, certainly on the device side, there was a lot of debate as far as the applicability of GAMP. I think now that debate will be settled. If you're looking for, kind of more understanding of what's likely to be in the CSA guidance, I sit on the GAMP Emerge Steering Committee, and there's been a lot of discussion in there. One of the latest guidance documents from GAMP, Data Integrity by Design, came out a few months back, has an annex on computer software assurance, and some of the folks that have influenced the writing of that have been very close to the FDA. So it's very reflective, I think, of what the ultimate guidance will say if you sort of want to get a leg up. The last thing I'll say on it, to kind of put a bookend from my initial conversation about the FDA and ISO 1345, is that it will be interesting to see how the CSA guidance is viewed globally. One of the changes to the last version of 13485 was the kind of further clarification of expectations for validation of off-the-shelf software from the regulatory authorities that use 1345 as their basis. So how the CSA sits outside of the US, how it's interpreted, how global companies then try and mix and match if they have an EU and a US regulator or a UK regulator to find the right balance will be interesting. So definitely something to keep an eye on. I think it ultimately will be positive, hopefully, provide a bit more focus for people and a bit more confidence that, risk-based approaches are the way to go.
Stephen, that's an excellent summary and very insightful look ahead. Just a reminder that our audience can ask questions anonymously, and we have a question here to Phil. Phil, it's a complicated area, but does remaining compliant always have to be time-consuming and costly?
It doesn't, no. And Stephen's just touched on this in his last answer there. It's all about the least burdensome approach, and by leveraging your supplier, whether you're using an on-site or a cloud-based environment, it's exactly the same. Leverage your supplier, leverage all documentation, leverage their expertise. Some of these systems that are being installed are reasonably complex behind the scenes, and so getting your supplier to do all the functional testing for you and make sure they have all the relevant documentation there available. So at Prism ID, we will make sure we do. We have a complete validation document pack which covers everything from validation test plan or a master test plan all the way through to a summary report. Having that document there, the evidence that supports it is just so important. But working with your supplier or your vendor there to say, you've done all this testing, this is the testing which we have to do. Through discussion, you can find the testing that matters, making sure your system is fit for purpose. That's really the key. That's the testing that you really need to do. So it doesn't have to be long and complex. It's all about that leveraging.
So perhaps following on from that, Doug, do you have anything to add on preparation packages?
Yes. When it comes to validation ready, you're, as Phil touched on, and also Steve, you want to make sure that all of the testing and evidence is available. You need to make sure that all of the qualifications of the platform are prepared, and there are validation packages available, so to help accelerate the output and get your validation system in and fully compliant. There really can't be a turnkey validation package. They do require customization to show business intended use. but that really shrinks the timeline to go from nothing to a validated system, and also shows the control and documentation sets when you are going to be audited.
That's great. Another one for you, Doug. Phil mentioned a couple of times in his presentation and in his answers just there that suppliers need to be leveraged. Is that your experience?
Absolutely. Not just PRISM, but a great many number of our customers leverage us for the qualification and documentation and test evidence of the entire platform. So that basis, that foundation, really gives everybody a leg up and a place to move forward from much further down in the project deployment lifecycle.
Great. Stephen, one of our attendees is interested in what auditors are looking at specifically and whether that's changed over time.
Yeah, I think one of the major changes obviously has been the shift from kind of legacy installed software to the cloud. Obviously, cloud delivered as a service is no longer a new thing. Very much at the kind of middle of the road understanding, or middle of the kind of evolution of it as far as people come into grips. But I think, for a long time, everyone's had a high level of comfort as far as assessing software, right? So the left side of SaaS, the first S software, many auditors out there are completely capable and competent when it comes to showing up and understanding whether somebody has a robust software development lifecycle. However, the right side of SaaS, the service piece, I think is still evolving. There's still a bit of a mismatch across auditors as far as their understanding of what it is they should be looking at and the right questions to ask. One of the things that we've seen a lot of, particularly with the SaaS vendors that we support, is questionnaires coming in and asking if they have their ISO 27001 certificate or their SOC 2 attestation report. And there's a couple of challenges with that. One, I think that often auditors are, and I don't mean this in a negative way, it's a reality, they might be looking for a bit of a box tick, show me that certificate and I'll leave you alone. And sometimes that's fine, but I think it's important if you're auditing that you have an understanding of, what the certificates mean, what the scope is, how they apply. I think it's important as well for auditors that when they're asking questions, they're thinking about the kind of layers of the cake, right? So, if you think of the, Doug's relationship with his vendors, right? So, Doug's infrastructure is qualified. He had his ISO 27001 certificate. He had his SOC 2 attestation reports, as well as other certifications, right? And that's that infrastructure layer, foundationally qualified, certified. If you're thinking about it from an audit perspective, then you also have to look at the application vendor and say, okay, what have you done for me, vendor, from the standpoint of not only proving that you deliver good software and that when I configure it, it's going to run the same way over and over again, but also that you have a handle on the service side, meaning you've got good IT governance practices. Perhaps you've gone and got a certification or two of your own to codify that. But I think that's an area that is still evolving as far as auditors' understanding of what the appropriate questions are, kind of going beyond, I'll just take that certificate, and, asking questions that are meaningful. ISO 27001 is great. We help customers, get to the point where they're ready for certification. The same thing with SOC 2. They're both super useful. But, they are cross-vertical certifications. They were not designed for the life sciences. SOC 2, as an example, slants very heavily on the financial side because it was written by, accountants effectively. So I think, for auditors, the pendulum has to swing back a little bit so that they understand what they're asking for and why. And I think if you're a SaaS vendor and you're kind of waiting to see what incoming audits are going to be like, it's really making sure that you completely understand your processes and have a strong message back for both the software piece and the service piece of your offering.
Great, thank you, Stephen.
To tag on to what Stephen said, this is Doug from Validated Cloud. I will say when we started this service over 10 years ago, auditors that came in didn't really have a firm grasp on how to audit us as a cloud vendor and a platform. And that has matured especially over the last 5 years. They have a better idea of our role and how they should look at us. And we started with GXP operations since the beginning. And I would say about 6 years ago, when we went to go get the 9001, ISO 9001 and 27001 certifications, the auditors were quite impressed with our controls that we had in place and were completely oblivious to what GXP meant. And by showing them that we had the GXP controls, it certainly made our ISO certifications a heck of a lot easier, but there is not a direct overlap. GXP still leaves additional areas of control, and especially hotspots right now around security and data integrity that the certifications alone do not cover. So the certifications are nice, but there's still additional areas in which, when qualifying vendors, that need to be addressed.
Great, thank you, Doug. We've had a question about validation master plans, and I wonder, Phil, can you describe what a validation master plan should look like?
Yeah, the validation master plan, it starts to lays out how you're going to meet your regulatory obligations. So it'll start to examine at the beginning, what's the purpose of the system, what are the objectives, are there user requirements, what are we trying to meet, or what business cases we're trying to meet. It'll lay out that kind of information. It'll then start to look at, are you going, what type of testing are you going to do? Are you going to leverage your supplier? And if you're going to leverage your supplier, have you done any kind of audit, be it a desktop or a more formal type of audit? And that audit will have some kind of outcome, and it will be that the audit finds the particular vendor policies, processes, and controls satisfactory, so they're in a position where you can use them. It'll go through the testing or the elements that you've had to put together to ensure that your requirements are being met, and then an output, a report detailing, against that plan, the plan of what you were going to do to meet your regulatory obligations, what actually happened. Did you meet it? Was there any deviation? If that deviation can be mitigated, what was that mitigation? So the plan is there to say to you, this is what I'm going to do to, with this system or with this solution, whether it be on-prem or cloud, how are we going to use it to meet our business requirements? So it'll look to start to detail that kind of information and that kind of process. So it's essentially, what am I going to do to meet my requirements? And then there's a report on the other side that says, well, this is how I actually did it. This is what actually happened during that process. Kind of things that if I was auditing, those are the things that I would look for, is look at the validation master plan, look to see what you were trying to achieve and how you were going to achieve it, and then look at the summary report as well and say, well, actually, what happened during that process? How did we do? Did we meet our requirements?
Great. Okay. Well, we've had a few questions about these validation master plans. I wonder, Doug, is the supplier involved in their creation, or what is their role?
Well, the suppliers are the subject matter experts when it comes to the application, and being able to create a suitable validation master plan for delivery for customers. The contents, what needs to be tested, suggested PQs, everything from the user requirements, because their user requirements are eerily similar to the user requirements that they're building their platform against. So they should align nicely. So the vendors should be able to produce a very high quality validation master plan because of, quite frankly, their expertise in the platform itself.
Great, thank you. Stephen, I'm going to roll a couple of questions into one here. I just wondered if there is any best practice that can be employed when creating test cases. And we've had another question in which says, how should a regulated company believe marketing messages that describe their applications as pre-validated? Would you mind covering off those 2 points for me?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take the first part of the question was about test cases, Andrew?
Yes, please, Stephen.
Yeah, I'll take that one first and come back to the other question because it's a great one. As far as test cases go, I mean, my advice, and certainly, when we are contracted to put test cases together for someone, if I'm breaking it down into 3 parts, the first thing I would say, which I think between Phil, Doug, and I have covered, is focus on your intended use. And that might sound, blatantly obvious. Like, of course, I'll focus on my intended use, but I've seen, validation odysseys that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And anytime I see that, I always question the necessity, frankly, and the value add. For a GAMP Category 4, which is an application that is effectively off the shelf that you are configuring, not customizing, right? So it's not something that you are asking someone to create in a bespoke way, or a platform that you've bought and then, had a bunch of developers do a whole bunch of additional customization to, but something that you've bought off the shelf or bought from the cloud and you are configuring. You do not have to retest the vendor's software. I've seen validation packages where people have literally started at the top left, clicked on file, gone through every possible menu, every possible thing that they think the application can do. Very, very rarely does that provide any value. What it does do, though, is put the focus back on requirements, right, and risk management. What is it that you want this thing to do? Have you assessed the risk of how you intend to use it versus product quality and patient safety? Additionally, you're going to have the, peripheral regulatory requirements like Part 11, right, electronic signatures, audit trails, depending on the scope of your application. So I think it's really important to make sure that your testing is truly risk-based. Don't retest the whole software, being the second point. I think another thing that we often see that is to the detriment of the quality of the work being done is an overemphasis on evidence. That might sound contrary, right, to proving that a validation has been done appropriately. But I've seen several 100-step test cases where every step requires a screenshot. I would always challenge that and say, look, if you think about the intended audience, right, certainly a validation is a company proving to themselves that the intended use is met, but also more than likely, your audience is going to be an auditor, either internally or externally. And in practical terms, what you want to be able to do is present them with a package that is very much focused on the true risk aspects of the system and scope. Giving them 5,000 screenshots is unlikely to provide them or you with a ton of value. Giving them audit trails and screenshots of truly risk-based areas or functionality or configuration tends to have a lot more value, and it can also take a lot of the time and bureaucracy, frankly, out of the validation process. So, someone taught me a long time ago, if a process doesn't make sense, don't follow it. And I think that's really important advice. If you're questioning why you're retesting, a piece of software that 10,000 other companies use, perhaps you need to take a step back and say, hey, what is the true risk of this in our context? How do we best use the validation approach to maximize the value of the effort and to really get our risk down to as low as is reasonably possible? To the second part of your question, Andrew, relative to the people kind of the marketing messaging, right? We're pre-validated, buy it off the shelf. I would always question that. I think that there's a lot of folks right now who will basically are pushing that concept that you can simply just buy it pre-validated and off you go. If you think about everything we've talked about today, Doug, Phil, and I have all talked about leveraging, right? Leveraging is not replacement, right? Leveraging is taking all the best practices from a vendor like Prism ID or Validated Cloud and using it as the foundation for your work, right? Regulated companies still have the burden of proving their intended use. And if you buy a validation package off the shelf that says you are done the moment you buy it, there will be very, very few use cases or applications where that is truly the case. So I would always be very skeptical of that as a reality. It sounds good, sure, but more often than not, it's just not practically true. Another thing I'll just say, just to add to that, is that one of the things that we often see is confusion with folks that have gone and bought an application that was sold as Part 11 compliant. It is a turn of phrase, but to be aware, Part 11 compliance requires the regulated company to validate their intended use. It requires them to write a letter to the FDA to let them know that they have selected a specific application and they will be using electronic signatures in lieu of paper or pen paper-based signatures. So that in itself is required to be Part 11 compliant. So if somebody says, oh, this is Part 11 compliant out of the box, they may certainly be fully supportive of Part 11 compliance, but in and of itself, without the regulated company taking those additional steps, they cannot claim it to be. So again, it's something I always watch for and just trying to educate so folks don't have a false sense of security and understand the regulatory burden fully.
Great, thank you. Someone's picked up on the phrase mentioned earlier, if it's not documented, it's just a rumour. And it does sound like it's straight from the lips of an overzealous auditor. Phil, can you explain how you might mitigate this and what are the materials that we might need?
Well, mitigation is it's all about leverage as part of it. So if you're moving into that arena, if you're looking to a supplier that's going to provide you with a commercial off-the-shelf solution, like a Prism ID here, we, as part of our package that we deliver with, we will deliver documents, test documents, functional specifications, OQ documents, installation qualifications, test summary reports, traceability matrix. We have OQs to support the document, and the way that our customers find out whether whether they're going to leverage and what they've got to do as well is they will do an audit on us, and we welcome an audit. I personally welcome audits from our clients where they can examine the documentation that we're providing. Does it meet their requirements? Are they going to be able to stand behind their business requirements to demonstrate the system's fit for intended use, plus the documentation and services that we can provide at Prism ID in terms of the COTS solution? Can they stand behind that when they are going toe-to-toe with the auditor? Being aware of what you can leverage and does it meet your needs is paramount, and the audit is the place to start that. It can be a simple desktop audit with some examples followed up by something a little bit more formal. You don't want to be sitting in an audit where someone is saying, well, okay, your system does this, but now prove it to me. Now, either your supplier's documentation, which you can leverage, if you've done all the necessary checks in terms of auditing to make sure they're fit for purpose, may demonstrate that. Or it may be that a combination of that plus an intended use case test proves it as well. And it's the use case tests which are, I think are really important. Your supplier's done all the testing they can from a functional point of view. Don't repeat it. Concentrate based on risk on your intended use case testing. You don't want to be caught out at the last stage to say, well, okay, you've got a use case here, but does it actually make that? You need to demonstrate it. You need to have some kind of evidence.
Thank you, Phil. We've only got 10 minutes left. So, Stephen, we've got a further question from the audience. You've talked about how to do validation. Perhaps you could explain what some of the pitfalls are. Perhaps things you hear from companies that may have a false sense of security around their own validation.
Yeah, no, happy to. So I think, when we come in and somebody's at that point where that kind of pitfall moment has happened, the horses are already left the stable. I think a lot of what we see is, especially with the SaaS platforms, there's often a desire to get into this kind of continuous integration, continuous development mode, right? So obviously, SaaS companies want to be agile, and they should. That sometimes doesn't always translate to life science applications. If you're in a release cycle that's sort of constant and daily, you have to make sure that that you as a procurer of those services understand that, right? So we've seen a few examples of folks that have bought into a SaaS platform, not completely understood the SLA, and not realized that the application effectively was going to be updated fairly frequently, even 3-4 times a year, which is reasonable, I think. But if you go into that and you don't understand it and you don't have your change management ready, it can get messy very quickly for a regulated company. So a lot of things like change management, how you level set with vendors needs to adapt on the regulated company side. I think too, for the vendors selling into the space, again, having the transparency and the confidence in their own product to say, hey, look, we get you, pharma company, we care about what you care about, and here's everything we're doing to help you. But I think there's an obligation at the point of sale to say, hey, look, customer, we want to make sure you fully understand our release cycle. Here's everything that we're doing to make sure that when we release as frequently as we do, we're not breaking anything. A lot of those conversations aren't happening. And unfortunately, I'm not sure there's a ton of understanding yet around tenancy models as an example, right? So if you are a SaaS vendor who is selling single tenant applications, that certainly from a life science company can seem attractive, right? Because you've then got that kind of sense of security, you've got your own database, you've got your own environment. The reality is, though, I think that if you want to be a SaaS vendor, often multi-tenancy is a far more attractive option. It allows you to get economies of scale on the delivery side, and it also allows you to make sure that everybody is on the same application, right? The same version of the application. So if you're trying to manage, if you imagine single tenancy, you have 100 customers and they're spread across 4 or 5 different versions. That's a lot of overhead, right? It's not 4 or 5 times, but there's certainly a multiplier in there. So it's really important for both sides of the equation to understand, what kind of cloud they've bought into, what the tenancy model is. I think too, I've seen folks buy into applications that are hosted in kind of the big box providers like your Amazon, your Azure, those types of things. And not really understand what that means relative to a life science delivery, right? Perhaps the vendor's really good at software, but they don't have a long history on the governance and infrastructure side, so they don't fully appreciate, how to set the architecture up so that they have a good recovery time and a good recovery point objective. Those are things that regulated companies often don't ask about and then are surprised about, often at the wrong moment, when the system is down. So I think there's just a lot of education that has to happen on both sides still. The concept of the cloud, I think people have bought into it, but I don't think they fully understand what it means always. So from a pitfalls perspective, that's typically where we see people tripping up. It's not so much that software is bad or service is bad as much as they don't really understand what they've bought. And they end up having awkward conversations later.
Great, thank you, Stephen. Doug, how do we cater for companies' future needs and their ongoing maintenance requirements? And how would life sciences and medical device companies go about procuring this?
So a lot of people think about validating an application is a project, and then once an application is validated, that's the finish line. And in reality, it is the beginning of a much longer effort, which is the continual maintenance of the application and the underlying infrastructure and the patching and the security and really keeping it in compliance through its entire life cycle. And for a validated application, unlike traditional IT systems that might have a 2-3 year life cycle, validated applications will have 3, 5, 7, and on manufacturing floors, sometimes even 10-year life cycle. So the onus of the effort is much more on the maintenance of the system than it is on its initial deployment. So helping life science companies mitigate this, having services that keep the application layer and the underlying supporting infrastructure patched and maintained in a lifecycle management process governed by change control and risk assessments really takes a lot of the burden off of the end user themselves. And that's really what Stephen was emphasizing before in the second half of SaaS, the as-a-service portion. And that's where you really can get the most value, not just on the run-up to the validated application, but the ongoing maintenance and support for the life cycle of the entire application life cycle.
Great. And Phil, I just wondered, do you have anything to add around Prism ID's own maintenance solutions?
Yeah, well, certainly first of all, we all need to remember that the ongoing process and change control going forward is part of your validation master plan. But we at Prism ID will ensure that any maintenance release is tested appropriately according to risk at Prism ID, again with objective evidence and documentation provided. We will then look to move this into the cloud environment and then make sure that we are testing against some customer solutions. So it may well be that we will take copies of databases or information and just do a quick check to make sure that we've not adulterated the system, because deploying this stuff into a cloud environment, if it's not done in a controlled manner, as you say, it will go badly very quickly.
Great, thank you, Phil. We've not got time for this next question, so we'll write all this up and circulate it in the next few days. But we did have a question around shifting to SaaS solutions and to the cloud, and the key things that make cloud different to other forms of software validation. And also looking at what the challenges and opportunities are when third parties are handling your data. But as I say, we'll get that written up, and that will be part of the pack that comes out after this event. So I'm very sorry that our time together is up, and we will send that write-up of the session over the next few days. In the meantime, do please visit the Prism ID website and follow Prism ID on LinkedIn for all of the latest updates. All that's left is to thank our speakers. It was fascinating to hear your experience from the coalface, so very many thanks, Phil, Doug, and Stephen. And thank you all for joining. I hope we can have your company again very soon. Thank you very much.